Today I'm at Huey Creek, which runs into Meilleur's Bay. I've come to the creek by walking through the Riley Bird Sanctuary, a property donated by Mr. Riley Bird to Ontario Nature many years ago. And it's a gorgeous property. I'm here today to talk about this creek, which is a bit unusual for the Ottawa Valley because it is a cold water creek. We don't have many cold water creeks in the Ottawa Valley. This creek, in fact, is so cold that it supports brook trout. Brook trout require cold water year-round in order to survive, and this is one of the few creeks in the Ottawa Valley that provides that. I'm going to talk about why that is, why this cold water creek is here. I'm also going to talk about a wetland, but mostly I'm going to talk about the Meilleur's Bay Esker. My name is Stow. I'm an ecologist, and this is the ecology of the Ottawa Valley. I've walked up Huey Lake Road and stopped at this little wetland, another one of my favorite wetlands. I don't know that it even has a name. I've just called it the Ogilvie wetland because it sits on the property of the Ogilvie family. The first year that I taught the environmental sciences field course at the University of Ottawa, I taught the wetland module, and this is the wetland at which I taught it. I love this wetland for several reasons. First of all, it's extraordinarily beautiful. The second is that it has a really high diversity of communities in a very small area. The wetland begins in a cedar swamp. It then transitions into an alder swamp, and then an emergent marsh, and then this wonderful beaver pond. And behind me in the beaver pond, it has a floating fen mat. That's a really incredible number of communities for such a small wetland. And finally, the other thing that I think is really cool about this wetland is that it is all groundwater fed. Now, wetlands by definition are areas where groundwater is near or at the ground surface. But in this case, there's only a very, very limited surface inflow into the wetland. It's a very tiny creek, only really 100 or 200 meters long, and that creek is entirely fed by groundwater. And that's one reason why I'm here, because that groundwater is coming from a very large feature called the Meilleur's Bay Esker. I've been walking up Huey Road and walking almost continuously uphill as I climb this feature called the Meilleur's Bay Esker. I've stopped here where there's a bit of a landslide scar, a slope failure, to give a sense of the shape of the esker and also the materials of which it's made. You can see this kind of curved feature. The road passes underneath it. You can see those pine, poplar up on top. And then as we get closer, you can begin to see the material of which this is made. Dig a little bit in here. We come up with sand mixed in with pebbles, gravel, cobbles. This is the material of which this esker is made. So what then is an esker? It's what we call a glacial fluvial feature. It is a water feature associated with glaciers. When the glaciers reached their maximum and started to melt, they of course were producing massive amounts of water. And that water would generally flow downward toward the base of the glaciers and then flow together to form channels, rivers below the glacier. The glaciers, of course, had ground the bedrock that they were flowing over into a mix of sand and gravel and cobbles. And these glacial rivers flowing below the glaciers would gather those materials into their beds. Then as the glaciers melted, the flows slowed, those glacial rivers would cease to flow, and they would drop all of that mix of sand, gravel, and cobbles. And in many places, you can see kind of the remnant channel in these long ridges of sands, gravels, and cobbles where the glacial streams used to be. The material is what we call sorted because the heavier materials would fall out first. So the cobbles, then the gravels, and then the sands, while silts and clays would be carried on further. As I talked about in my previous two videos, sands, gravels, cobbles are very permeable materials. Water flows through them very, very quickly. And so just like the sandbars that border the edge of Mer Bleu, these eskers, like the Meilleur's Bay esker, are places of groundwater infiltration. Precipitation falling on this esker infiltrates the water very, very quickly, up to 20 centimeters per hour, and flows downward and then out laterally from the base of the esker. So the base of the esker is an area of groundwater discharge. So the Ogilvie wetland, which we talked about, is actually nestled in a curve of the Meilleur's Bay esker, and it is entirely supported by groundwater that seeps out of the base of that esker. So is Huey Creek, and that's why Huey Creek has brook trout in it. I've scrambled up this little slope because I wanted to get this view across this small valley. This small valley is actually where Huey Creek cuts through the Meilleur's Bay esker. And you can get a general idea of the shape of the esker by the shape of the tree canopy across the other side of the valley. You can imagine, I hope, the underlying ridge on which those trees are situated, and looking at the shape of that canopy, get an idea of the shape of that ridge. Very steep-sided, very high. Imagine it flipped upside down and you would have basically the bed of a river. And that's what an esker is, the bed of a river that has been inverted as it has been dumped by the retreat of the glaciers. Huey Creek flows along the base of the Meilleur's Bay esker and cuts through it at this point, and consequently Huey Creek receives groundwater from the esker. And I'm going to take you to a spring showing some of that groundwater flowing into the creek. So far, I've had a remarkable lack of success in finding a spring. The spring that I usually visit was actually submerged by the creek, which appears to be running quite high right now. We've had a lot of rain over the last few days. I'm surprised at how muddy looking the creek is. Normally this creek in midsummer is lower, very, very clear, because it's carrying mostly groundwater. But we have had a lot of rain over the last couple of days, and this creek is now carrying a lot of clay, a lot of silt, which has muddied it up. But I've stopped here because I've reached the point, working my way upstream, where the creek actually cuts through the Esker. And you can see the slope of the Esker behind me. And you can see these very large boulders in the base of the creek. That's because these boulders are at the very base of the Esker. The creek is cut down to the base of the Esker. When the Esker was a glacial fluvial river, these boulders would have been rolling along the bed of that river. And when the glaciers retreated and dumped all that load into this long Esker, those boulders settled at the very base of it, and that's what we're seeing here. So I'm going to go and start working my way downstream and see if I can find myself a spring. So here we have a seep. Joins up with some other seeps, and I'm going to see if I can find where it outlets, if in fact it does. You can see that this little spring is picking up volume. It's flowing a little more quickly. You can see some of the sands through which it's flowing. And just off to my right, I can hear the creek. Let's go take a look. There is so much sand along the sides of this Esker, or either eroded off the Esker or carried by Huey Creek itself, that when the creek starts to flatten out, it starts to braid quite a bit. It cuts multiple channels through the sand, and that's what we have here. We have a smaller channel of Huey Creek that's cut through the sand, and here is that small spring that we have been following down from the side of the Esker. Doesn't look very impressive, but in midsummer, when particularly on dry summers, it's this type of flow, this groundwater flow, this base flow, that maintains the creek and maintains it as habitat for brook trout. It's cold water, and brook trout need cold water year round to survive. It's not just groundwater's not coming in just from springs like this, but it will actually be upwelling from the bed of the creek itself. And we get a lot of that upwelling in this creek because these soils are so sandy. A lot of the water, the groundwater, will simply percolate through the sands like we see in front of us into the creek, never emerging. But we do, in areas, get these springs, which are more concrete evidence of that groundwater flow. So I hope that you've enjoyed my last video about sands. In my next few videos, I'm going to be talking about wetlands, and I hope you will join me for those discussions. Thank you very much.